Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome to the Chronicles of Christendom. Today we're going to be talking about an author who's very near and dear to my heart. And honestly, he's the reason why I started this podcast. It wasn't so much for this story that we're about to get into, but for another story that he wrote later in his life. But today we're going to be talking about Chrétien de Troyes. He was a French writer, writing like the 1170s to about the 1190s. We don't have too much background about who he is. There's a couple bits and pieces in the intro to some of his stories, like about who's sponsoring the work, like who his patron is, but we don't really have much more information than that. So today we're going to be talking about his first story here that he wrote. Generally, it's just generally agreed upon to be the first story that we have of his, at least. It's called Erec and Enide. And what's interesting about this story of Erec and Enide is that it's the first French Arthurian work that we have. As well, another interesting thing about this work is that it's really one of the first courtly romances that we have, generally speaking. Like, it really defines the genre in many ways. But the thing that I love about Chrétien's stories is that they're just full of symbolism. They're very easy stories in some sense to tell, like the events that happen. It's very straightforward for the most part, I would argue. However, there's all these little details that Chrétien throws in that points to something bigger going on in the story rather than just the mere, materialist reading of the text. And because of this, a lot of people have given these very strange interpretations of Chrétien, like alchemical interpretations or these like pagan interpretations of him and all this other kind of weird stuff. I don't really think that's in the text. That's not really the esoteric meaning I think that's there. Rather, I think a Christian reading does a much better job at explaining a lot of the weird symbolism that you see throughout the text. So we'll find a bunch of that in Erec and Enide, and I'll bring it up, of course, when we come across it. But with Chrétien's stories, and I've done a lot of research on a lot of his stories, especially this one, I still don't think I know everything that's going on symbolically. There's just a lot of, and again, we'll talk about this here later, but there's just a lot of really weird stuff that goes on that I think I have a somewhat decent guess at. However, sometimes I'm just at a loss, and I'll let you guys know. Also, I will say that this will be a two-parter, so this is going to be part 1 of 2. As well, we are going to be going through, at least I hope, we'll be going through a lot more of Chrétien's stories. My plan is to go through all of them, although we might skip 1 or 2, but his collected works is pretty short. Like the Penguin edition I have is just around, I think, a little under 500 pages or so. So not too difficult, and there's a bunch of stories in there, so I think we can do that. Anyways, let's jump into the story. So we can now jump into the story, and I'll start us off by reading Chrétien's introduction. He says, "The peasant in his proverb says that one might find oneself holding in contempt something that is worth much more than one believes. Therefore, a man does well to make good use of his learning, according to whatever understanding he has. For he who neglects his learning may easily keep silent something that which would later give much pleasure. And so Chrétien de Troyes says that it is reasonable for everyone to think and strive in every way to speak well and to teach well. And from a tale of adventure he draws a beautifully ordered composition that clearly proves that a man does not act intelligently if he does not give free rein to his knowledge for as long as God gives him the grace to do so. This is the tale of Erec, son of Locke, which those who try to live by storytelling customarily mangle and corrupt before kings and counts. Now I shall begin the story that will be in memory for evermore, as long as Christendom lasts. Of this does Chrétien boast." So that's Chrétien's introduction, and it might sound a bit weird because, Chrétien refers to himself in the third person, right? But what's interesting is that I think, and I'll show this later in part 2, I think that this little introduction, especially with the peasant and his proverb where one finds oneself holding in contempt something that is much more valuable than one thinks, I think that that's kind of the core of the story, as we'll see. And I think that Chrétien kind of lays out the entire structure of the story in that little preamble he has for this tale. As well as he makes the note that, it's important to know how to speak well. And this is going to become a very important part of the story. So let's continue reading. On Easter Day in springtime, at Cardigan his castle, King Arthur held court. So rich a one was never seen, for there were many good knights, brave and combative and fierce, and rich ladies and maidens, noble and beautiful daughters of kings. But before the court disbanded, the king told his knights that he wanted to hunt the white stag in order to revive the tradition. So Arthur wants to have a hunt for the white stag, and there's a lot of symbolism in like the white stag and hunting and things like that. But we'll kind of skip over that for now. But there's a sort of problem with the hunt for the white stag, and it's a problem that's pointed out by Gawain, Sir Gawain, who's in this story, at least in this version of the Arthurian legend, he is King Arthur's nephew, as well as we're told by Chrétien that he's also the best of all the knights. He's the most valiant, the most honorable, etc., etc. So Gawain reminds King Arthur that whoever kills the stag, afterwards, he is supposed to bestow a kiss on the most beautiful maiden of the court. However, he points out the fact that, if this happens, there's a lot of, beautiful women at the court. There's a lot of people who are willing to defend that their lady is the most beautiful. And this is going to cause a huge ruckus at the court. So Gawain's like, look, maybe we shouldn't do this. Be very careful. But Arthur kind of brushes him off. And nonetheless, the next morning, they go out and hunt for the white stag. But Erec, our titular character, or one of them, he goes out in the morning. However, he doesn't get his armor on. All the other knights, they're getting their weapons, they're getting their armor, all of that to go hunt for the white stag. However, he doesn't. He just goes out in a silk tunic made from Constantinople. So, all these other guys, they have on their, their armor and their swords and shields. But Erec, he's just going out in his dress clothes, so to speak. And he doesn't go with the hunting party either. He really just stays back and hangs out with the Queen Guinevere, so this is King Arthur's wife, along with one of her maidens. And then while they're kind of strolling around on their horses, so to speak, they see this armed knight with another fine maiden, but there's a dwarf also surrounding them. And the queen says to her maiden who's with them that she should go over there and beckon the knight and her maiden to come over because the queen wants to speak to them. But when the maiden goes up to talk to them, the dwarf stops her. And the dwarf has this sort of whip. And he tells the maiden to go away and he whips her. So, with her bruises, she comes back, tells the queen what happened. And then Erec says that he'll go up and try to, tell the knight to come over with his maiden. But when he goes up, the dwarf is, still there and he also whips him. And remember, Erec doesn't have any armor on, so, he's, pretty hurt by that whip. Then Erec tells the queen that in order to avenge her, he is going to follow the knight and his maiden and his dwarf all the way to where they're going, and that he will return in 2 days, having restored her honor. So Erec goes off and follows them to where they're going. And in the meantime, Arthur was able to get the stag in the hunt, and they go back to court, and absolute chaos breaks out just as Gawain had foresaw, right? Because, he's supposed to now kiss the most beautiful lady of the court. However, everyone is saying that their lady is the most beautiful and that they're willing to take up arms to defend that claim. Eventually, though, the queen intervenes, and she tells them that they should all wait to discuss this matter further when Erec comes back. And everyone at the court agrees. And I forgot to note earlier that Erec is considered second to Gawain in terms of chivalry, in terms of bravery, etc., etc. Chrétien does boast a lot about Erec, but he says Gawain is better than him, and Erec is second, although perhaps a close second. So Erec eventually follows the knight into a nearby town. And there's a lot of festivities going on in the town, a lot of joy, a lot of games. And Erec sees that the knight he's been following is received into the town with much fanfare. And Erec eventually is able to find lodging in the town through the generosity of a impoverished nobleman. And this nobleman is rather poor. Both his daughter and his wife, it's mentioned, are working at a workshop. And the nobleman cites his poverty due to losing all of his lands due to extensive warring. And when Erec sees the nobleman's daughter, he is absolutely starstruck. The lady came out, as did her daughter, who was dressed in a flowing shift of fine cloth, white and pleated. Over it she wore a white dress. She had no other clothes, and the dress was so old that it was worn through at the elbows. On the outside the clothing was poor, but the body beneath was lovely. The maiden was very beautiful, for nature in making her had turned all her attention to the task. Nature herself had marveled more than 500 times at how she had been able to make such a beautiful thing just once, for since then, strive as she might, she had never been able to duplicate in any way her original model. Nature bears witness to this. Never was such a beautiful creature seen in the whole world. In truth I tell you, that Isolde the blonde had not such shining golden hair, for compared to this maiden she was nothing. Her face and forehead were fairer and brighter than the lily flower, contrasting marvelously with the whiteness. Her face was illuminated by a fresh, glowing color that nature had given her. Her eyes glowed with such brightness that they resembled two stars. Never had God made a finer nose, mouth, nor eyes. What should I say of her beauty? She was truly one who was made to be looked at, for one might gaze at her just as one gazes into a mirror. So we then learn a couple more things about the town and this family. So we learn that the count of the town is this maiden, the very beautiful woman. It's her maternal uncle. And we also learn that the father has been very protective of his daughter and hasn't let her marry anybody, even though many nobles have proposed marriage with her. We also learn that there's a competition in town, and this explains all the fanfare and all the festivities that we saw. Specifically, the competition, it's called the Sparrowhawk competition, and the knight with the dwarf normally wins, and that's why the knight was received into the town with so much joy. And so this is how the father explains the competition. He says, "Tomorrow there will be great excitement when they are all assembled," so the town assembled. "For in front of all the people, seated on a silver perch, there will be a very fine sparrowhawk, 5 or 6 years old, the best that can be found. Whoever wants to win the sparrowhawk will need to have a lady who is beautiful and wise and free from baseness. If there is any knight bold enough to claim for his lady the reputation honor of being the most beautiful, he will have his lady take the sparrowhawk from its perch in front of everyone, if no one dares oppose him. They uphold this tradition, and that is why they come here each year." And Erec sees an opportunity here. This is how he is going to defend the queen's honor. He has to compete with the man's daughter, and he also asks for some armor because, as it was mentioned, he didn't have any armor when he left the castle for the hunt, and he, wanted to make sure he could follow the knight, so he didn't go back and get any. And the father accepts, and, only after learning of his pedigree, he learns that he is the son of a king and all that. And he even recognizes who Erec is and his fame. So now the entire household is very joyful because they have found a good suitor for the daughter. And then the next morning, Erec and the father, they go to mass. And then Erec takes the daughter, and, it should be said that this is Enide, but we don't actually learn that's her name until a little bit later on. Anyways, Erec and Enide go off to the tournament. And the knight who has won the past couple years, he just assumes that he's going to win again. He doesn't expect any competition. And he sends his maiden out to go and grab the sparrowhawk. But Erec intercepts her. "Damsel," says Erec, "away, be satisfied with some other bird, for you have no right to this one, regardless of whom it may upset. For this sparrowhawk will never be yours, for a better one than you claims it, a much more beautiful and courtly maiden." Upon this, the other knight comes out and begins to fight against Erec. And they fight for a rather long time. They end up knocking each other off their horses, and then they just start fighting on foot with their swords, and they're very evenly matched. Because they're so evenly matched, the fighting goes on for quite some time, and eventually they agree to take a temporary break. And the poem says, "Then they rested briefly. Erec looked towards his lady, who was very softly praying for him. As soon as he saw her, his strength was renewed. Because of her love and her beauty, he regained his great courage. He remembered the queen, to whom he had said in the woods that he would avenge his shame or else increase it further." They then begin to fight again, and Erec eventually gets the best of him, and he takes him as prisoner. So this is a common thing that you see in these chivalric stories, where when one knight beats the other knight, normally they don't actually kill each other, rather one eventually surrenders to the other and basically says, "I am your prisoner." and then they tell him to, go somewhere, go to a castle, go to a court, go to a specific person, and, do whatever that person tells them to do. So in this case, Erec tells the knight that he needs to go to King Arthur's court and present himself as a prisoner to the queen. And then he goes off and he goes to become prisoner to the queen. And the queen is very lenient and basically just says that he has to stay at court. But Erec doesn't go back yet. He actually goes back to his host's place, and he says that after he marries the daughter, that he will give the impoverished noble, he will give him lands, and as well, he will marry her at King Arthur's court. But he's very specific about this and very insistent that she will be dressed as she is now. So in that dress that she has, it's very torn and worn out. And I'll read here from the poem. There was in that place a very prudent, sensible, and worthy maiden, seated on a bench beside the maiden in the white dress, and she was her first cousin and the count's own niece. When she heard that Erec wanted to take her cousin to the queen's court, dressed so very poorly, she spoke about it to the count. Sir, said she, it will be a great shame for you, more than for anyone else, if this lord takes your niece along with him so poorly clothed. And the count replied, I beg you, my sweet niece, give her the one you consider the best from among your own dresses. Erec heard this request and said, Sir, do not speak of that. Let me tell you one thing. I would not for any reason wish her to have any other dress until the queen has given her one. So this is what I mean by in Chrétien stories, there's always these weird little details sort of sprinkled in. And I consider this one such an example. But I think the answer will become a little bit more obvious a little bit later, and we'll see here in a second. And then I'll talk about it more there. But let's continue with the story. So Erec and his bride head off to King Arthur's court, and he refuses to take anyone else with him. Even though several people want to come with him, he says, no, we are going alone. And the poem describes them as this sort of perfect match. It says, but the damsel for her part looked at the knight no less than he looked at her, with favorable eye and loyal heart, in eager emulation. They would not have accepted a ransom to leave off looking at one another. They were very well and evenly matched in courtliness, in beauty, and in great nobility. They were so similar, of one character and of one essence, that no one wanting to speak truly could have chosen the better one or the more beautiful or the wiser. They were very equal in spirit and very well suited to one another. Each of them stole the other's heart. Never were two such beautiful figures brought together by law or by marriage. So the couple arrives at Arthur's court, and the first person they go to is the queen. And then Erec says to her, My lady, I bring you my maiden, and my lady love, clad in poor garments. I bring her to you just as she was given to me. She is the daughter of a poor vavasor. Poverty abases many men. Her father is noble and courtly, but he has no substantial wealth, and her mother is a very noble lady, for she has a rich count as her brother. Neither beauty nor lineage would be cause for me to disdain marriage with this maiden. Poverty has made her wear this white dress so often that both sleeves are worn through at the elbows, and yet if I had been willing, she would have had plenty of fine clothes. For a maiden, her cousin, wanted to give her an ermine dress with silken fabric, trimmed with vair and miniver. But I was totally opposed to her being dressed in any other clothes until you had seen her. My sweet lady, now consider this, for as you can see, she has need of a fine and fitting dress. And then the queen responds, and she says, You have acted very properly. It is right that she should have one of mine, and I shall immediately give her an elegant and beautiful brand new one. So Erec brings his lady to the court with her very, worn out dress that we mentioned earlier, and he refuses to let her change at all or, have any gifts of new clothing until the queen would give her one. Now, the question is, why is this? And people have speculated about this. However, what I think is going on here is that it has to do with hierarchy. Since Enide is going to marry Erec, who is, the son of a king, it would be inappropriate for her to accept a dress from her cousin, who is the daughter of a count, because she is, in a sense, through their future marriage, ascending the hierarchy, and it's only appropriate that someone at a higher level is able to raise her up. So that would be like the queen giving her clothing rather than accepting it from her cousin. It's kind of like what St. Paul says in Hebrews when he says that the lesser can't bless the higher. And it's pretty obvious in the poem that this is considered a good thing, right? Even the queen says, that Erec did the right thing. So after Enide gets her new dress, they then go to the court, and they are able to solve the whole dilemma with the stag hunt about choosing the most beautiful woman, because everyone agrees that Enid is the most beautiful woman, and then the king gives Enid a kiss, and the stag hunt issue is resolved. And then the poem says, here ends the first movement. So this probably means something like this is just the prologue. It's not too clear why he says this. In his other stories, at least to my recollection, there's not anywhere where he says this at all. Like where he says like, oh, this is just the prologue or this is just the introduction. But I think the reason why Chrétien says this is because immediately after we have the wedding of Erec and Enide. And I think what Chrétien wants to do is to emphasize that the wedding between Erec and Enide is the beginning of the story in a sense. It's not the middle, it's not the end, it's the beginning of the narrative. So after the stag hunt is resolved, Erec asks Arthur if he can be wed at his court. Arthur, of course, agrees and is ecstatic about it. And then he says, we will have you married on Pentecost. So our story started on Easter, a couple of days passed, and then Pentecost would be 50 days after Easter. And Arthur invites all of his vassals to the wedding. And I want to highlight some of the guests real quick. It says, the Lord of the Dwarves came next, Billis, king of the Antipodes. The man of whom I'm speaking was indeed a dwarf, and a full brother of Bliant. Billis was the smallest of all the dwarves, and Bliant his brother the largest of all the knights in the kingdom by half a foot or a full handbreadth. So Antipodes just means like the end of the world. You can view it that way. It means like the very extreme or the exact opposite. So at the very edge of Arthur's empire, there is a dwarf and a giant. And I think that just goes to show you, when you have the edge of something, you get a lot of weird things coming about. You get some monsters, so to speak, who appear. Like, the smallest of all the dwarves, who is the full brother to the largest of the giants. And this also goes to show that within Arthurian literature, at least in Chrétien's world, the dwarves and the giants aren't necessarily always bad. We'll find some other dwarves and giants later. Some of them are good, but others are bad. And I just wanted to point this out because I've read some pretty bad journal articles, frankly, that say that Chrétien is trying to paint all giants and dwarves as just ontologically evil, when that's just not the case. And it's at the wedding where we first learn Enid's name. So the poem reads, when Erec received his wife, she had to be named by her proper name, for unless a woman is called by her proper name, she is not married. People did not yet know her name, but now they learned it for the first time. Enid was the name given to her at baptism. In a lot of Chrétien's stories, you don't always know people's names, or people don't even always know their own names. And people sometimes in his stories ask for other people's names, and sometimes they will refuse to give it to them. Oftentimes when two knights fight, after one surrenders to the other, the one who asks for mercy, the one who is defeated, he asks the victorious knight for his name. And we have to remember that for about 47 or so days while they're waiting for their marriage, Erec and Enid are at court, and presumably they're talking and socializing. However, for several weeks, no one knows what this lady's name is until her wedding day. I don't know exactly what's going on there. Maybe it has something to do with like identity and the fact that she's being married. She's kind of given this new identity with a name, or she's finally being given a name. I'm not too sure. I think that's another one of those weird things that's in Chrétien's stories that really challenges you as a reader. So once they get married, there's then a 2-week-long festival, feasting, partying for the married couple. And then they also hold a tournament. And then Erec asks to leave with Enid, much to Arthur's chagrin. He doesn't really want him to leave, but he allows him to leave. And then they go off to his father's land. And there's also much joy and fanfare when they're received there. But once they get settled into the kingdom, Erec becomes what we would now call like a wife guy. He completely becomes isolated with his wife. They just spend all their time together. He doesn't go out jousting. He doesn't go out fighting. He doesn't go off questing. He makes sure that all of his servants and his squires and the knights have all the stuff they need. But he's really not out and about. He's really just kind of locked up with his wife. This is how the poem describes it. Erec was so in love with her that he cared no more for arms, nor did he go to tournaments. He no longer cared for tourneying. He wanted to enjoy his wife's company, and he made her his lady and his mistress. He turned all of his attention to embracing and kissing her. He pursued no other delight. His companions were grieved by this, and often lamented among themselves, saying that he loved her far too much. Often it was past noon before he arose from her side. This pleased him, whoever might be grieved by it. He kept very close to her, but still continued to provide his knights with arms, clothing, and deniers. Wherever there was a tournament, he sent them there, most richly apparelled and equipped. He gave them fresh chargers to tourney and joust with, regardless of the cost. All the nobles said that it was a great shame and sorrow that a lord such as he once was no longer wished to bear arms. He was so blamed by everyone, by knights and men-at-arms alike, that Enid heard them say among themselves that her lord was becoming recreant with respect to arms and knighthood, because he had profoundly changed his way of life. This weighed upon her, but she dared not show it, for her husband might have taken it ill had she mentioned it. The term normally used to describe Erec is uxorius. It's a bit of an older word, but it comes from the Latin word for wife, which is like uxor, so it means like somebody who's a little too attached to their wife. So Erec has become very uxorious, but he's unaware of his reputation. His wife, however, is deeply grieved by what people say. And then one night, she ends up crying and talking to herself, thinking that Erec is asleep. But then Erec really isn't asleep, and then he wakes up, and he then asks his wife why she's crying, and to repeat what she just said. After trying to evade the issue for a moment, she eventually says, "My lord, since you press me so, I shall tell you the truth. I shall conceal it from you no longer, but I fear it will distress you. Throughout this land, all people, the blondes and the brunettes and the redheads, are saying that it is a great shame that you have laid down your arms. Your renown has greatly declined. Previously, everyone used to say that there was no better or more valiant knight known in all the world. Your equal was nowhere to be found. Now everyone holds you up to ridicule, young and old, high and low. All call you recreant. Do you believe it does not distress me when I hear you spoken of with scorn? It grieves me deeply when they speak so, and it grieves me even more that they place the blame on me. That I am blamed for it grieves me particularly, and everyone says it is because I have so bound and captured you that you are losing your renown and your concern for everything else. Now you must reconsider, so you may put an end to this blame and regain your former glory, for I have heard you blame too much. I never dare to reveal this to you. Repeatedly, when I recall it, I have to weep with anguish. Just now it caused me such pain that I could not restrain myself from saying you were unfortunate." And then right after, Erec agrees with her and says, "You are right to do so, and those who blame me are also right. Prepare yourself at once. Make ready to ride. Arise from here and put on your most beautiful dress. Have the saddle placed upon your finest palfrey." Now Enid was deeply afraid. She arose, very sad and distraught. She accused and criticized herself for her ill-advised words. And then Enid says, it looks like she's saying this to herself, she says, "Wicked fool, I was too well off, for I wanted for nothing. Ah, wretch, why was I so bold as to dare speak such madness? God, did my lord not love me too much? In faith, alas, he did indeed. Now I am to be exiled, but it grieves me even more that I shall see my lord no more, who loved me so greatly that he cherished nothing else as much. The best man ever born had so devoted himself to me that he cared for nothing else. I wanted for nothing. I was most fortunate, but pride raised me up too high when I said such an outrageous thing. I shall be punished for my pride, and it is entirely right that I should be. You cannot recognize good fortune if you have not tasted misery." So the question is who's in the wrong? Is she in the wrong, or is Erec in the wrong? And it seems like the poem kind of says that, in a sense, both of them are in the wrong. In the monologue that we just read, she says that pride raised her up too high, but she also says that indeed her lord did love her too much. I think we're given another clue though when it talks about Erec who was getting ready. It says that Erec sat on the other side upon the image of a leopard, which was portrayed in the rug, and prepared to arm himself. Now, the leopard is very symbolically rich in the medieval world. Even the word leopard, it's kind of two words combined together. The same is true in English as in most other languages. It's like leo, which means like lion, and then pard. And a pard is like it's a type of panther. If you look at like medieval bestiaries, oftentimes when you see leopards, you see them with like the body of a panther. However, they have like the head of a lion with like its mane. And there's a few elements to this symbolism. One is that it's an improper mixture caused by lust. Because of this, it's often the symbol for like the Antichrist. However, it's also the symbol for the repentant sinner as well. So I do think that the story is blaming Erec quite a bit for what's going on, but it's given him an opportunity for repentance. And I think we're going to see that here later in the story. I also want to add that I don't think that this behavior of Erec is new with regards to his wife. There was a little bit of foreshadowing going on earlier with the stag hunt, where Erec does not participate in the stag hunt, and we're not really given a reason why as to why he didn't. It just says that he doesn't, and he just hangs out with the queen and one of her maidens. So however much Enid is to blame, it seems that she's only to blame as much as she is kind of going along with Erec, whereas Erec was doing this, kind of being uxorious, not able to integrate properly into society even before he was married. So Erec puts on this very flashy armor. It says that it shone more brightly than a mirror, and he has Enid put on her most beautiful dress, and then they head out. While they're leaving the castle, many knights come out and try to ask if they can come along, but Erec says that he's only going with his wife. And then his father, King Lack, comes to talk to them, and he says, "A king's son must not travel alone. Dear son, have your pack horses loaded and take along 30 or 40 of your knights, or even more, and have silver and gold brought along and everything befitting a gentleman." At length, Erec replied and told him everything and related how he had undertaken his journey. "Sire," he said, "it cannot be otherwise. I shall take along no spare horse. I have no need of gold or silver, squires or men-at-arms. I ask no company other than my wife's. But whatever may happen, if I die and she returns, I pray that you should love her and hold her dear, for love of me and because I ask it, and that you grant her half your land, freely, without battle and without strife, for the rest of her life." And then everyone began to cry, and then Erec and his wife rode off alone. And the poem doesn't really give any indication where they're going. It just says, "knowing not where, but open to adventure." I think the best way to view them leaving is, as Enid earlier said, like a form of exile, which in biblical terms also acts as a form of purification as well. In Orthodoxy, the start of Lent is equated to the expulsion from the garden. Although it is an expulsion going out into the wilderness, it's there for purification, spiritual purification, and to return back to God. In this case, though, I think it is the purification of their marriage, you can say, but also for Erec, it serves as the purification of his knighthood. Because one thing that Chrétien does in a lot of his stories is that he tries to blend this idea of the romantic and chivalric knight with marriage, unlike later authors who oftentimes, put those two things into contradiction. As they ride out into the wilderness, Erec tells her, "Ride rapidly, and take care not to be so reckless. If you see anything at all, to say a single word to me. Mind you do not speak to me unless I speak to you first. Go ahead briskly, in complete confidence." "My lord," said she, "as you wish." And then almost immediately, as they're riding out, Enid sees these 3 robber knights who are charging up on them, but she realizes that Erec does not see them, and she has this whole sort of internal monologue about whether or not she should speak to Erec or not to inform him about the knights coming. But eventually she speaks and tells Erec about the knights approaching. "What?" said Erec. "What did you say? You really have too little esteem for me. You have shown very great presumption in disobeying my orders and doing what I forbade. You will be forgiven this time, but if it happens again, you will not be forgiven." And then Erec goes off and deals with the knights. After he kills them, he gives Enid the 3 horses to take care of, and then tells her again to ride in front of him and to not speak a word. But then the same pattern repeats, but this time with 5 knights, where Enid debates whether or not to speak because she realizes Erec isn't paying attention, and then eventually she decides to speak. Erec rebukes her, and then he goes and kills the knights. After he kills them, he again makes her take care of the horses, so now she has to take care of 8 horses, and it mentions that it's kind of difficult for her to carry along all those horses. They end up making camp in the wilderness without being inside of any town, and Enid volunteers to stay up all night watching so that Erec can rest, to which Erec agrees to. And during the night, she blames herself even more. She bitterly blamed and cursed herself for the remark she had made, saying she had acted badly and had not half as much misfortune as she deserved. "Alas," she said, "how I regret my pride and my effrontery. I should have been absolutely sure that there was no knight equivalent to or better than my lord. I knew this full well. Now I know it better, for I have seen with my own eyes that he fears neither 3 nor 5 armed men. May my tongue be completely disgraced for having spoken the prideful and outrageous things for which I now suffer in such shame." And so she lamented all night until daybreak. And then they keep traveling in the morning, and eventually they find a town, and they're also lodged in that town. And the count of that town hears of them, and he comes to visit them. And while talking with Erec, the count keeps looking over to Enide because he covets her. She inflames his passions. And so then he asks Erec if he can go and speak with his wife. And then he agrees, and because Enide is sitting on the other side of the room, so they're able to talk without Erec being able to hear them. And while they're sitting together, the Count essentially tries to seduce her. He says that she's being mistreated and that he can give her all this stuff, but Enide sharply rebukes him. She says, "Better that I were not yet born, or burned in a fire of thorns, so that my ashes might be scattered, than that I should in any way be false towards my lord, or wickedly contemplate disloyalty or treason. You have made a very great error by requesting such a thing of me. I would not do it in any way." And then the Count resorts to blackmail and says that if she doesn't do as she wishes, then they're just going to kill Erec. And then so Enide realizes that she's in quite a predicament. So she uses some craftiness to get out of the situation. She says that she will go along with the Count. However, they should wait until morning and have the knights come and then seize her, and then she can be with the Count. And Enide uses a lot of flirtatious language here, some of it quite explicit as well. But she still loves Erec, and she's just doing this to defend them. As the text says, she knew well how to intoxicate a rogue with words when she put her mind to it. It was far better that she lied to him than for her lord to be cut to pieces. So after this, the Count says goodbye to both of them, and then they head off to sleep. But Enide doesn't actually end up falling asleep. And it should be noted here that she didn't sleep last night either, so she has stayed up for the past 2 nights. And then early in the morning, before daybreak, she informs Erec of the plot. And the poem says, Erec could see clear proof of his wife's loyalty to him. And there was no rebuking for speaking. In fact, after the 5 nights incident, Erec doesn't tell Enide, or at least in the poem we don't learn, that he tells her to be quiet. So Erec and Enide get ready really early in the morning, and then they head off to ride, trying to escape from the Count's men. And even though Enide just saved his life by telling him of the plot, and she was even commended for what she did, nonetheless, as they're riding off, Erec then again tells his wife that she should not speak unless spoken to. So the Count then comes to the place where Erec and Enide were staying, and he brings along a lot of his knights as well. And when they realize that they're not there, they follow their tracks, and then they're eventually able to catch up to them. And then Enide, seeing that all these knights are coming, immediately tells Erec. And then again, Erec rebukes her, but then he turns around and kills one of the knights, and then is able to knock the Count off his horse, and then they're able to ride off into the forest to escape them. And then while they're wandering through the forest, they find this tower that has a moat and it has a drawbridge, and then they cross over the drawbridge. But while they're crossing over the bridge, the lord of the land sees them, and then he armors up, and then he goes out to challenge Erec. But he's not going out to challenge Erec as in to, go up to him and then challenge him to a fight. Rather, he just starts riding off at him, trying to attack him. And we learn that this lord is actually a dwarf. Well, he's not explicitly called a dwarf. However, he is called very short in stature. And then later on, he's called the Short. So it's pretty obvious that he is some form of dwarf. So he starts charging at Erec. And then again, the similar pattern happens where Erec doesn't see it. And it realizes that Erec doesn't see it. And then Enide speaks to Erec, informing him of the danger, and then Erec rebukes her, but then Erec handles the situation. But this time there's a slight difference in what happens. This is how the poem renders it. She spoke to him, he threatened her, but had no wish to harm her, for he perceived and knew full well that she loved him above all else, and he loved her with all his might. And this is the last time in the poem where this thing happens, where Erec gets mad at Enide for talking. Another thing different in this instance is that normally when Erec goes off and fights, whoever is coming at him to attack him, he's able to deal with them very quickly and without taking any damage. But this time, his fight with this dwarf knight takes a very long time. It says that they fought until mid-morning to mid-afternoon, and that they both inflicted substantial wounds on each other. Eventually, Erec is able to best him, and the knight surrenders to Erec, and then we learn his name. We learn his name is Kibbler the Short. He's a powerful nobleman. He also offers to help Erec with his wounds. He says that he has a nearby castle with some doctors who can heal him. However, Erec refuses. I am grateful to you, Erec says, for what you have said. I shall not go with you by your leave, but I ask just this of you, that if any need should befall me, and the news reach you that I need help, then you should not forget me. And then Kibbler says, My lord, I promise you that as long as I live, whenever you need my help, I will quickly come to aid you with all the resources at my command. I wish to ask no more of you, said Erec. You have promised me much. You are my lord and friend, if your deeds match your words. Each of them kissed and embraced the other. Never from such a fierce battle was there such a sweet parting, for moved by love and generosity, each of them cut long, broad bands from the tail of his shirt, and they bound up each other's wounds. When they had bandaged each other, they commended each other to God. They separated in this way. Kibbler came back alone. Erec, who was badly in need of dressing to care for his wounds, resumed his journey. And from a narrative standpoint, that's where we're going to wrap up this episode. So we'll finish up this story in the next episode. However, I do want to mention one thing before we leave. I want to bring us back to the very, very first part of the story, where Chrétien says in his little sort of prologue, he says that the peasant in his proverb says that one might find oneself holding in contempt something that is worth much more than one believes. Therefore, a man does well to make good use of his learning according to whatever understanding he has. For he who neglects his learning may easily keep silent something that would later give much pleasure. And I think we've seen this prologue become a sort of microcosm for the rest of the story. So Enide is going to be that thing which someone holds in contempt that is worth much more than one believes. It is also the thing that someone who neglects his learning is going to keep silent, something that would later give much pleasure. And we see this happen quite literally in the poem. Erec constantly tells Enide that she needs to be quiet. However, it's through her words in which she is able to save him. And it takes several times for this pattern to repeat itself before it's able to be instilled into Erec's brain. What I also like about this poem is that it shows that marriage is not the end of the story. Right, in many stories, especially modern stories, it's very almost cliche that the movie or whatever story ends with the marriage. And the idea is that they live happily ever after, or at least that's the implication. But Chrétien does something rather different here. He puts the marriage at the beginning of the story. And then they don't live happily ever after. There are certain issues that come about in their marriage that they have to undertake and deal with. And that's part of the reason I find this story so interesting, is because of the alternatives it offers to these modern tropes.